My grandfather once told me, "Never threaten a man who has what you need and knows you can't get it anywhere else. That's not leverage. That's just noise." Right now, that wisdom is playing out on a continental scale in one of the most essential but least discussed commodities on Earth, potash, the potassium-rich mineral that makes modern agriculture possible. Without it, crops fail, yields collapse, food prices spike, and no amount of political rhetoric changes the basic chemistry of plant growth. The United States finds itself in an uncomfortable position. American farms consume millions of tons of potash annually. American soil produces a fraction of that, and the country that supplies the overwhelming majority of American potash imports is the same country that American trade policy has been threatening, pressuring, and alienating for years. Canada. Before we continue, let me be clear. This video is analysis based on publicly available trade data, geological surveys, and documented policy decisions. I'll distinguish between verified facts and reported figures that may vary by source. The goal is understanding, not sensationalism. Let's start with the basic geology, because geology is where this story begins and ends. Potash is a potassium-bearing mineral essential for plant nutrition. Along with nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium forms the foundation of modern fertilizer. Plants need it for water regulation, disease resistance, and overall growth. There is no substitute, no alternative nutrient performs the same function. Agriculture without potassium is agriculture with dramatically reduced yields. The world's potash deposits are not evenly distributed. They formed over millions of years in ancient seabeds, and they exist where geology placed them. Regardless of political boundaries or trade policies, Saskatchewan, Canada, sits on one of the largest potash deposits on Earth. According to geological surveys, Canadian reserves are estimated to be several times larger than American reserves. The exact figures vary by source, but the scale difference is not disputed. Canada has vast potash resources. The United States has limited ones. This geological reality shapes everything that follows. According to industry data, the United States imports approximately 90% of the potash it consumes. Of those imports, roughly 80% come from Canada. The remainder comes primarily from Russia and Belarus, countries facing sanctions pressure and supply uncertainty. American domestic production is measured in hundreds of thousands of tons. American consumption is measured in millions of tons. The gap cannot be closed by executive order, by tariff threat, or by wishful thinking about domestic production. The deposits simply aren't there in sufficient quantity. Saskatchewan alone reportedly produces over 20 million tons of potash annually. That's more than 4 times what the United States consumes in a year. Canada is the world's largest potash producer and exporter, controlling roughly 30% of global production and over 40% of global exports. This is the context in which trade threats must be understood. According to reports, President Trump has at various times threatened significant tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, launched investigations into Canadian potash companies, and suggested that the United States could simply produce its own fertilizer domestically. The reported statements reflect a pattern, threaten tariffs, claim domestic production can replace imports, pressure Canada into concessions. But the pattern collides with geological reality. You cannot tariff minerals into existence. You cannot threaten deposits out of the ground. And when your agricultural sector depends on imports, you cannot replace, the threat creates more problems than it solves. American farmers have reportedly understood this immediately. According to multiple reports, farm state senators and agricultural organizations have pushed back against fertilizer tariff proposals. Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, a state heavily dependent on potash for corn and soybean production, has reportedly urged the administration to exempt fertilizer from tariff threats. The concern is straightforward. Higher fertilizer costs mean lower farm profits. American farmers sell into global commodity markets where prices are set by supply and demand, not by individual farmer pricing power. They cannot pass increased input costs to consumers. They absorb those costs directly. And when costs exceed revenues, farms fail. According to industry analysts, fertilizer accounts for 30 to 45% of a typical American farm's annual operating costs, depending on the crop. It's not a marginal expense, it's a foundational one. Significant price increases ripple through the entire agricultural economy. This creates an unusual leverage dynamic that trade negotiators sometimes fail to appreciate. In most trade disputes, tariffs hurt both sides. The importing country pays higher prices. The exporting country loses market access. Both have incentive to negotiate. But potash is different because the United States cannot easily find alternative suppliers. Russia accounts for perhaps 8 to 10% of American potash imports. But Russian supply comes with geopolitical complications, sanctions considerations and reliability questions that make it an uncertain alternative. Belarus, another major producer, faces similar constraints. Canada is practically speaking the only reliable large-scale source of potash for American agriculture. That's not a negotiating position. That's a geological fact. When you threaten tariffs on something you cannot replace, you're not creating leverage. You're creating self-inflicted costs. American farmers pay more. American food costs rise. Canadian producers find other buyers. And that's precisely what appears to be happening. According to trade data and company announcements, Canadian potash producers have been actively diversifying their export markets. Brazil, the world's largest agricultural exporter, reportedly now receives approximately 14% of Canadian potash exports. China and India, with their massive agricultural sectors and growing fertilizer needs, are expanding purchases. This diversification is not a response to any single policy. It reflects long-term strategic thinking. Global agricultural markets are growing fastest in Asia and Latin America. The United States market is relatively mature and stable. From a business perspective, focusing on growing markets makes sense regardless of trade tensions. But trade tensions accelerate the shift. When American policy becomes unpredictable, when tariff threats appear and disappear, without clear pattern, when the regulatory environment changes constantly, Canadian producers have additional incentive to reduce their exposure to American market volatility. According to reports, Nutrien, the Saskatchewan-based fertilizer giant, has announced plans for an export terminal in Washington state, specifically designed to ship potash to Asian markets. The terminal would reportedly handle 5 to 6 million tons annually, representing a major infrastructure investment oriented toward non-American customers. BHP, the global mining company, is reportedly investing over $20 billion in its Jansen Potash project in Saskatchewan. According to company announcements, the project's production is largely destined for Asian markets, particularly China. First production is expected in 2027. These are long-term investments, multi-decade commitments. They reflect assumptions about where future demand will be and where reliable customers exist. If American policy were stable and predictable, some of this capacity might serve American markets. Under current conditions, it's being oriented elsewhere. This is the pattern Carney's government has reportedly encouraged. Diversification, reducing dependence on any single customer, building relationships with markets that offer growth potential and policy stability. The strategy doesn't require confrontation with the United States. It doesn't require retaliation or trade war escalation. It simply requires recognizing that Canadian resources are valuable globally and finding customers who want them without the accompanying political uncertainty. Brazil needs potash desperately. The country is one of the world's largest agricultural exporters, feeding global markets with soybeans, corn, coffee, sugar, and beef. But Brazil has essentially no domestic potash production. It imports 100% of its potassium fertilizer requirements. Canadian potash helps Brazil feed the world. India faces similar constraints. The country has 1.44 billion people to feed and no significant domestic potash deposits. India must import potassium fertilizer. Supply security matters enormously. A government that cannot guarantee fertilizer supply cannot guarantee food supply. Canadian potash helps India maintain food security. China, despite significant domestic production, still imports substantial potash quantities. Food security is a strategic priority for Beijing. Canadian potash helps China feed its population. These are not transactional relationships. They are strategic partnerships built on geological reality and mutual need. Countries that lack potash need countries that have it. Canada has it. The relationships follow. Now, let's examine the American side of this equation. According to reports, the Trump administration has taken various approaches to the fertilizer issue. Times, tariffs have been threatened or imposed. At other times, they've been reduced or removed. Policy has reportedly shifted multiple times, creating the uncertainty that undermines long-term planning. The administration has also reportedly pursued domestic production initiatives. According to announcements, a Michigan potash project received over $1 billion in government loan guarantees. A Utah project received federal grant funding. The goal is increasing American production capacity. These efforts are real, but they face constraints. According to industry analysts, even fully operational, the announced domestic projects would produce roughly 1 million tons of potash annually. American consumption is over 5 million tons. Domestic production would cover perhaps 20% of demand. The remaining 80% would still require imports. This is not a criticism of the projects themselves. Increasing domestic production makes strategic sense for supply security, but it cannot eliminate import dependency. The reserves aren't there. The scale isn't achievable. Geological reality persists. This creates a policy tension that has no easy resolution. The United States wants leverage over Canada. Tariff threats are the obvious tool, but tariff threats on potash primarily hurt American farmers while pushing Canadian producers toward other markets. The leverage doesn't work because the dependency is too asymmetric. Meanwhile, American farmers have reportedly received substantial government support to offset trade war damage. According to various reports, billions of dollars in bailout payments have gone to farmers affected by retaliatory tariffs from China and other trading partners. Fertilizer cost increases add to the financial pressure these payments are meant to address. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Trade policy creates costs. Bailouts offset costs. Taxpayers fund bailouts. Policy doesn't change. Costs continue. More bailouts follow. From a Canadian perspective, this dynamic is manageable. Canada has resources the world wants. Multiple customers are available. American market access is valuable, but not irreplaceable. Trade threats create short-term uncertainty, but accelerate long-term diversification that reduces Canadian vulnerability. From an American perspective, the dynamic is more problematic. American farmers need potash. Canadian potash is essentially irreplaceable at scale. Trade threats raise costs without achieving strategic objectives. Bailouts mask damage without resolving underlying issues. This is the asymmetry that geology creates. Countries with essential resources have leverage. Countries that depend on those resources have exposure. Political posturing doesn't change the fundamental math. The broader lesson extends beyond potash. In an interconnected global economy, few countries are fully self-sufficient in all essential inputs. Supply chains cross borders. Dependencies exist in both directions. Trade relationships reflect these interdependencies. Threatening disruption to these relationships carries costs for everyone. But the costs aren't always distributed equally. The country with fewer alternatives bears more exposure. The country with more alternatives has more flexibility. Canada has alternatives for selling potash. The United States has limited alternatives for buying it. That asymmetry shapes what's possible regardless of what's threatened. This doesn't mean trade disputes are unwinnable or that leverage never works. But it does mean that leverage depends on actual alternatives, not just rhetorical positions. Threatening to do something costly to yourself is not particularly threatening to others. American agriculture needs Canadian potash. That need is structural, geological, and not easily changed. Policies that ignore this reality create costs without benefits. Policies that acknowledge this reality can pursue realistic objectives within actual constraints. Mark Carney's approach reportedly focuses on the latter. Diversify markets. Reduce vulnerability to any single customer. Build relationships with growing economies that need Canadian resources. Let geological advantage speak for itself. This strategy doesn't require winning arguments or demonstrating dominance. It simply requires recognizing that valuable resources attract customers. When one customer becomes difficult, others are available. The United States remains a significant market for Canadian potash and will likely remain so. Complete decoupling is neither realistic nor necessary. But reduced dependence creates options. Options create resilience. Resilience reduces vulnerability to political pressure. That's the strategic position Canada appears to be building. Not confrontation, but diversification. Not retaliation, but alternatives. Not winning the argument, but transcending it. American farmers will continue needing potash. Canadian producers will continue supplying it among other customers. The relationship will continue, shaped by geology more than politics. But the terms of that relationship are shifting. Canadian producers now have more customers. American buyers face more competition for supply. Leverage flows toward the country, with resources and alternatives away from the country, with dependency and limited options. This is how geological advantage becomes strategic leverage, not through threats or negotiations, but through the patient accumulation of alternatives that make threats less meaningful. The potash beneath Saskatchewan isn't going anywhere. It will be there for decades, perhaps centuries. The question is who buys it and on what terms. Right now, Canada is building a future where that question has multiple answers. Brazil, China, India, and growing. Markets across Asia and Latin America offer demand that didn't exist a generation ago. The United States can be one customer among many, or it can be the primary customer with a stable, predictable relationship. That choice depends on American policy, not Canadian resources. Geology doesn't negotiate. Reserves don't respond to tariff threats. And countries with essential resources can afford to wait while countries without them figure out their options. That's the position Canada finds itself in, not through any particular brilliance, but through the simple advantage of having something the world needs. The question is whether American policy will recognize this reality or continue pretending leverage exists where geology says it doesn't. Stay informed. This story continues to develop.